Welcome, dearly beloved anointed ones. You can buy a judge, you can silence a cop, you can rent the media, but you cannot rewrite the law that was written before mankind ever existed. Let that sink in. For centuries, empires have fallen not because they ran out of money, soldiers, or propaganda, but because they forgot the one principle that cannot be bribed, silenced, or manipulated. Truth always reports back to its source. They thought their wallets were almighty, but the universe doesn't accept cash. It only accepts balance. Here's a fact for you. Throughout history, regimes and powerful elites have successfully controlled courts, police forces, and media outlets. Ancient Rome did it. Medieval monarchs did it. Modern governments do it even more cleverly. But there's a hidden pattern. No matter how much control they thought they had, every system eventually buckled under the weight of its own corruption. It wasn't the opposition that destroyed them, it was the invisible law of return, the one they arrogantly believed they could outsmart. Now here's where it gets ironic, and a little funny. They had files, networks, bribes, and blackmail. You had nothing but the truth, and yet that truth was nuclear. Like a cosmic Wi-Fi signal, it doesn't need permission to broadcast, it doesn't need their subscription plan, and best believe it never runs out of data. While they were busy paying for silence, you were unlocking the one law that charges nothing but costs everything. So buckle up, because in this breakdown we're not just talking about corruption or rigged systems, we're diving into the law they overlooked. The law that requires no judge, no jury, no headline, the law that works whether they believe in it or not. And by the end of this, you'll understand why their empire of control was always doomed to collapse the moment you discovered the one rule they could never afford to break. Number one, corruption can purchase power, but it cannot reprogram conscience. They had the money, they had the influence, they had the power to pull strings in courtrooms, silence cops who knew too much, and make entire media outlets bow at their feet. On paper, it looked like victory, but there was one thing they couldn't buy: the conscience. That inner law that no human court can fully suppress, that voice inside every soul that whispers when something is wrong. They overlooked it because they thought power could erase morality. But conscience isn't for sale, and the longer it's ignored, the louder it grows. When people talk about corruption, they often focus on the transactions, the bribes, the backroom deals, the hush money. But what they don't realize is that every act of corruption plants a seed inside the very people who took the bribe. A judge might smile on the outside and hand down a false verdict, but when the robe comes off and the silence hits, they're left alone with themselves. And the law of conscience does not grant peace to the guilty. They may sleep in luxury, but they wake up haunted. This is what you tapped into, the hidden law that they couldn't touch. You didn't fight them with wealth, power, or loud allies. You fought them simply by standing in alignment with that incorruptible voice. It's the reason truth has outlasted every empire, every tyrant, every manipulator in history. Because while power can silence witnesses, it can never silence what is written on the inside of every person. The conscience is like a locked vault that refuses counterfeit currency. And here's the twist. They thought they were untouchable because the system bowed to them. But the more they paid to hide their wrongs, the more their conscience stored evidence against them. It's the kind of evidence no lawyer can argue away and no media spin can bury. It doesn't need headlines, it only needs time. And time is ruthless in exposing guilt. This is why they fear you, because while they live in denial, you live in truth. While they buy silence, you carry the law they cannot mute. And the moment you unlock that law, their power stopped being power and turned into prison bars they built with their own hands. That's the law of conscience, the one they overlooked, but the one that has already judged them. Number two, the system can be rigged, but the universe cannot be hacked. They worked so hard to manipulate the system. They had judges in their pockets, police officers on their payroll, and journalists spinning stories to keep their image clean. To them, that was the ultimate shield. They believed that once man's systems were under their control, nothing and no one could touch them. But the mistake they made was assuming that the system was the highest authority. It never was, and it never will be. Because beyond the rules of man exists the law of the universe, a law that cannot be bribed, hacked, or twisted. The universe operates on a code that doesn't bend for anyone. Call it cause and effect. Call it balance. Call it divine order. It's the same principle that has governed existence since the beginning of time. Every action carries a consequence. Every lie has an expiration date. Every injustice builds pressure until it demands correction. They forgot that while human courts can be tricked and human eyes can be blinded, the universe records everything. Nothing slips past it, not even the things done in shadows. They thought they had erased your chances, but what they really did was plant their own downfall. The higher law doesn't punish immediately because it doesn't need to. It lets people believe they've gotten away with it. And that false sense of security is what traps them. While they were laughing, confident in their control, the balance was quietly preparing to even the score. And when the universe responds, it doesn't knock politely. It crashes in with precision, timing, and weight they cannot withstand. This is the law you unlocked. You didn't need to fight them on their rigged playing field because the greater law was already at work. You realize that corruption may delay justice, but it cannot deny it. What is owed will always be collected one way or another. And the more they rigged the system, the heavier their debt became. That's why their empire is crumbling. It wasn't your voice versus their money. It was their money versus the universe, and money loses every time. They forgot that you don't have to chase justice when the law of balance is already following them like a shadow. That was their blind spot, and it's the very thing that turned all their victories into time bombs waiting to explode. Number 3. Lies can dominate headlines, but they cannot outlive time. They poured money into media outlets, paying for stories to be rewritten, headlines to be buried, and cameras to turn the other way. For a while it looked like their lies had won. The world only saw what they wanted it to see, but lies are fragile things. They can dominate the surface for a moment, but they have no foundation. Time itself becomes their executioner. No matter how loud or convincing a lie sounds, it begins to rot the second it's spoken. Truth, on the other hand, doesn't need to shout. It waits, it stands, it survives. They overlooked one of the oldest realities in existence. Time always sides with truth. History has proven it again and again. Dictators, corrupt leaders, and manipulative voices have had their era of control, where the narrative seemed untouchable. But once the years rolled on, their names were dragged into disgrace while the truth they tried to bury rose from the ashes stronger than ever. A lie may glitter for a season, but time strips it down until it's nothing but dust. This is why their control of the media was never real control. They were simply buying themselves a delay. They could bury the truth under headlines and noise, but what they buried was not dead. It was alive, biding its time, growing roots deeper than they could imagine. And when the right moment arrived, those roots cracked through their carefully built facade. Lies age poorly, they wrinkle, they collapse, they betray the very people who believed in them. You, on the other hand, stood on truth, and truth doesn't expire. It doesn't need editing, PR, or spin. It carries the weight of eternity. That's why, while they scrambled to maintain their version of reality, all you had to do was outlast them. Every day that passed was not in their favor. It was building the case against them. This is the lesson they never learned. You don't have to argue with lies or chase after every rumor. Time dismantles them on its own, and when time finally finished its work, their empire of deception collapsed, leaving them exposed and you still standing. They thought headlines could crown them, but headlines fade. The truth doesn't. That was their undoing. Number 4, they controlled man's law, but not the law of balance. They were obsessed with control. They pulled strings in courtrooms, silenced voices in the streets, and manipulated the story that reached the public. To them, this was victory. They believed if they could control man's law, they had rewritten reality itself. But there's a law older and far greater than anything written on paper, the law of balance. And balance is not a suggestion. It is not something that negotiates or bends for anyone. It is a force that moves with exact precision, and it always collects what is owed. Every act of injustice is not forgotten. It's recorded on the scale. Each time they manipulated outcomes, Each time they exploited their power, the scale tilted further against them. For a while they didn't notice, because man's law gave them the illusion of success. But the deeper truth is this: the universe doesn't operate on illusions. It operates on correction. And the longer injustice continues, the greater the correction that must come. They didn't just rig the system against others, they rigged it against themselves. Every unfair advantage became a debt they could never repay. Every lie they used to climb higher only made the fall more violent. What they called power was actually sabotage in disguise, and what looked like control was a countdown to collapse. The law of balance doesn't care about titles, money, or influence. It only cares about alignment. And once you step out of alignment, correction is inevitable. This is why their downfall was unavoidable. They thought corruption guaranteed them immunity, but corruption is its own curse. They were building their future with bricks of imbalance, and no matter how high they stacked them, it was always destined to topple. You didn't need to fight them on their level. You only had to let balance do what it has done since the beginning of time. That's why you survived, and that's why they're crumbling. You stood in truth, which kept your side of the scale light. They stood in deception, which weighed theirs down until it could no longer hold. And when balance finally demanded correction, all their power couldn't stop it. They thought they were untouchable. But the law of balance doesn't miss. It always returns what's due, and it returned everything back to them with interest. Number 5, influence can shield them from exposure, but not from consequence. They moved like shadows, confident that as long as the cameras stayed silent, their image remained untarnished. They paid off the media, covered their tracks, and erased any evidence that could expose them. In their minds, if nobody saw it, it never happened. But that's where they were wrong. Exposure is a tool, but consequence is the law, and consequence doesn't wait for headlines. It moves quietly, invisibly, and inevitably. They believed control of perception was the same as control of reality. But perception fades when the lights are off. Reality continues, and consequence lives there. While the world stayed blind to their actions, their own lives became the stage where consequences played out. Their relationships crumbled because trust cannot coexist with deceit. Their minds grew restless because guilt cannot coexist with peace. Their nights were haunted because no amount of wealth can buy silence from the conscience. This is the part they never prepared for. They built fortresses against exposure, never realizing that consequence was already inside the walls with them. Cameras can be turned off, newspapers can be bought, but the ripple effect of their actions cannot be paused. Every lie infects their circle. Every betrayal isolates them further. Every injustice eats away at their health, their mind, their spirit. Exposure threatens reputation. Consequence dismantles the soul. And here's the irony. Exposure can sometimes be survived. People rebuild images, rebrand themselves, and return to the public eye after scandals. But consequence, that cannot be rebranded. Once consequence has taken root, no PR team, no spin doctor, no carefully crafted apology can undo it. They may have escaped the humiliation of public disgrace, but they could not escape the private destruction of consequence. This is why you outlasted them. You weren't banking on exposure to prove you right. You understood that consequence would prove you right without a camera in sight. And that's exactly what happened. They look powerful to the world, but behind closed doors, they are prisoners of their own choices. Their sleepless nights are louder than any headline, and their paranoia is more damning than any journalist could ever be. They thought silence was safety, but silence only made the consequences louder. Number 6, you discovered the law that requires no permission to operate. They played the game of manipulation well. They bent judicial rules, twisted political influence, and corrupted social systems to work in their favor. Everything they touched seemed to bow under the weight of their power. But what they didn't realize is that all of those laws they controlled had one flaw. They required permission. Judges had to sign, officers had to act, media had to publish. Man's laws operate on approval, votes, and agreements, but the law you discovered bypasses all of that. It doesn't ask, it doesn't wait, it doesn't negotiate, it executes itself. That's why it terrified them. They couldn't trace it, stop it, or lobby against it. They were used to dealing with opponents they could threaten or pay off. But how do you bribe inevitability? How do you silence a law that operates without human hands? They were powerless against it because it doesn't show up in courtrooms or newspapers. It shows up in reality itself. And once it begins moving, nothing can slow it down. This is what separated you from them. While they spent all their energy controlling systems built by man, you aligned yourself with a principle that existed before any of those systems were even created. They thought control meant safety, but control built on man's rules is fragile. One shift, one leak, one moment of exposure, and it all collapses. But the law you tapped into cannot collapse. It doesn't need witnesses, signatures, or evidence. It simply is. That's why you survived what destroyed others. You weren't relying on a judge to validate you, or a politician to protect you, or a headline to speak for you. You leaned on a law that has no gatekeeper. It doesn't need the majority to agree before it acts. It doesn't need society's approval before it unfolds. And that's why their empire of influence couldn't compete with what you carried. They thought their strength was in bending systems, but their greatest weakness was forgetting that there are laws above systems, laws that don't require permission to work. And by discovering and aligning with that law, you triggered a power they could never contain. It moved quietly, invisibly, yet with perfect precision. And by the time they realized it, the verdict had already been written. Number 7. They underestimated the currency of integrity. They measured wealth in dollars, power and influence, and safety and connections. To them, money was the ultimate weapon, the guarantee that no matter what happened, they could buy their way out. But what they never accounted for is that there's a higher economy at play, one that doesn't trade in cash or favors. That economy runs on integrity. And integrity is a currency they never invested in because they didn't see its value. Yet it's the only currency that heaven recognizes. And once you carry it, no amount of corruption can bankrupt you. Integrity buys things their money could never touch. It buys protection that no bribe can imitate. It's why doors open for you that they couldn't shut, no matter how hard they tried. It's why opportunities found you even when you had fewer resources. Integrity operates in silence, but it has influence in places they cannot reach. Their networks may stretch wide, but integrity stretches higher, and that's a realm no amount of scheming can penetrate. They assumed your lack of wealth or power meant you were weak. They didn't realize integrity was your shield. While they were surrounded by allies who only stood near them because of money, you attracted people drawn to your truth. And those allies, whether visible or unseen, are far more dangerous than anything money can buy. Because loyalty bought with wealth dies when the money runs out. But loyalty tied to integrity endures even under pressure. This is why they couldn't destroy you. Every attack they launched against you only reinforced the value of your currency. Every injustice made your integrity shine brighter, while their corruption exposed them further. They had the kind of power that burns fast and fades. You carried the kind that multiplies when tested. They were playing with temporary wealth. You were investing in eternal credit. And here's the part they'll never accept. Integrity cashes out in places where money is worthless. When sickness comes, money buys doctors, but integrity buys peace. When enemies rise, money buys silence, but integrity buys unseen protection. They thought they were rich, but in the economy that truly matters, they were bankrupt. You were the wealthy one all along because you carried the one currency heaven never rejects. Number 8, bribery can erase records, but it cannot delete energy. They thought erasing a file meant erasing the truth. They believed silencing officers or paying off witnesses would wipe the slate clean. On paper they succeeded. Records disappeared, evidence was buried, and the story looked airtight. But they forgot one thing. Energy cannot be deleted. Every action carries a vibration, and every vibration carries memory. Bribery may edit history books, but it cannot rewrite the energy of what actually happened. That energy lingers, it circulates, and eventually it finds its way back home. This is the flaw in their strategy. They treated corruption as though it were a final solution, when in reality it was just a delay. The universe isn't fooled by missing files or fabricated reports. It doesn't need human paperwork to track injustice. It deals in energy, and energy is the most reliable witness there is. What they did, how they did it, and the motives behind it, all of it was imprinted in the field of reality itself. You can shred documents, but you can't shred energy. And the most dangerous part for them was this: energy doesn't just sit still. It moves, it multiplies, and it seeks balance. Every dirty action they took was an investment in their own downfall, because energy always returns to sender, not quietly, not equally, but amplified. That means what they pushed out in corruption, betrayal, and deceit is coming back multiplied, heavier, louder, and impossible to silence. That's why their lives became restless. That's why no amount of money could buy them peace. They weren't just battling you, they were battling the return of their own energy. It came back in sleepless nights, in paranoia, in the slow unraveling of everything they built. And the harder they fought to suppress it, the stronger it returned. This is the law you unlocked. You realized that corruption can erase what man sees, but not what the universe remembers. You didn't have to chase them, because the energy they released was already chasing them down. And when it finally arrived, it wasn't just equal repayment, it was multiplied consequence. They thought they had wiped their slate clean. In reality, they had only written their downfall in ink that cannot fade. Number 9, the higher court doesn't need witnesses, it needs truth. They built their defense the way they built everything else, on manipulation. They paid for fake testimonies, created false witnesses, and even forged statements to make their version of events look airtight. To them, it was simple. Control the narrative, and you control the outcome. And for a time, man's courts bowed to their performance. But what they didn't realize is that there is a higher court, one that doesn't operate on theatrics or deception. That court doesn't need witnesses, it only needs truth. The higher court doesn't weigh credibility, it weighs reality. It doesn't ask, who said what? It asks, what actually is? That's why their elaborate web of lies was doomed from the start. The higher law cannot be distracted by forged papers or corrupted testimony. Truth isn't something that can be fabricated, and it doesn't need defenders. It stands on its own because it exists whether people believe it or not. That's the power they couldn't manipulate. Their greatest mistake was believing truth was fragile. They treated it as if it could be silenced with enough money or erased with enough signatures. But truth is not fragile. It's indestructible. Lies need constant maintenance, constant reinforcement, constant performance. Truth doesn't need any of that. It remains steady, waiting for its moment to rise. And when it does, no amount of fake witnesses can overpower it. You didn't need to fight on their terms. You didn't need an army of lawyers or a crowd of supporters to back you up. You were aligned with truth, and that meant you were aligned with the only evidence that matters in the higher court. And while they laughed, confident that their witnesses would secure their victory, the higher law was already dismantling them from the inside. This is why they've lost, even when it looked like they had won. Their verdicts may have been stamped and sealed in human courts, but those papers carry no weight where truth is the only authority. They thought they had escaped justice, but justice had already recorded their sentence. They thought their lies were enough, but truth doesn't argue, it simply exists. And that existence was the law they could never touch. Number 10, they were playing Monopoly, you were playing eternity. They thought life was a board game. Every move they made was about acquiring more property, more influence, more status symbols to prove they were winning. Their focus was on who could own the most, control the most, and silence the most. It was all about the next headline, the next deal, the next trophy. But that's the difference between playing Monopoly and playing eternity. Monopoly ends the moment the board is folded up. All the fake money, all the plastic houses, all the victories vanish into nothing. Eternity doesn't work that way. It doesn't end. It carries every action forward into destiny. This is where you separated yourself from them. You weren't playing for temporary wins. You were operating on eternal law. That means you weren't just thinking about the next move. You were thinking about alignment, truth, and destiny. They may have laughed at you for not having what they had, but what they couldn't see is that everything they built was destined to expire. Power built on lies has a shelf life. Wealth hoarded through corruption has an expiration date. Influence rooted in manipulation dies the moment people wake up. Eternity doesn't deal in expiration dates, it deals in permanence. That's why you outlasted them. Their focus was shallow, what they could buy, who they could impress, how much they could grab before the clock ran out. But eternity doesn't measure wins in possessions. It measures them in truth. While they were scrambling to hold on to what they thought was victory, you were aligning with what can never be taken away, and that's why everything they built eventually started to collapse, while everything you stood on only grew stronger. Here's the irony. They thought you were losing because you didn't play their game, but in reality you won because you didn't. They couldn't understand that once the board is packed away, their mansions, titles, and media spins mean nothing. But your choices, your integrity, and your alignment with eternal law carry forward forever. They invested in toys, you invested in destiny. And when the game ended, you were still standing because eternity doesn't fold, it remains. Number 11. You turned their weapons into evidence against them. They thought their schemes were clever. Every bribe handed over, every report silenced, every headline rewritten was meant to protect them, to bury the truth so deep it could never surface. They believed they were erasing their guilt with every move, when in reality they were documenting it. What they didn't realize is that corruption leaves fingerprints everywhere. Every dishonest act doesn't just disappear, it becomes evidence. Not the kind of evidence man's courts rely on, but evidence written in a language that only divine law reads: energy, intention, and consequence. This is what they overlooked. Their weapons weren't destroying you, they were building the case against themselves. Each time they paid someone off, it wasn't just a secret deal. It was another entry in the record that heaven keeps. Every time they silenced a witness, they didn't erase the truth. They only proved how afraid they were of it. And every time they manipulated headlines, they weren't controlling the story. They were broadcasting their guilt in invisible ink that time itself would reveal. The irony is that they thought they were outsmarting you. They thought you were powerless because the system was tilted against you. But the system they corrupted became their own undoing. In their desperation to cover their tracks, they made their guilt undeniable. It's the nature of divine law. What is hidden becomes evidence, what is used as a weapon becomes proof, and what is meant to destroy you ends up testifying for you. That's why their empire of control is collapsing, not because you exposed them, but because their own actions exposed them. The more they tried to secure themselves, the more they trapped themselves. The very tools they used to silence truth became the receipts of their corruption. And when the higher law reviewed the evidence, there was no debate. It was written by their own hands. This is why you didn't need to fight them on their level. You didn't need to chase after every bribe or every lie. You only had to stand still and let divine law translate their corruption into evidence. In the end, their weapons didn't destroy you. They testified against them. Every move they made to bury you only built the record that sealed their own fate. Number 12. They ruled with fear, but you activated the law of immunity. Fear was their greatest weapon. It was how they controlled judges, silenced officers, and kept the public from asking questions. Fear is cheaper than bribes and stronger than threats. Because once a person is trapped in it, they'll police themselves without anyone lifting a finger. That's the environment they thrived in. A climate where no one dared to resist, where silence was mistaken for safety. But their entire empire depended on one condition: that you too would be afraid. The moment you stopped fearing them, everything changed. Fear is what gave their power weight. But once you refused to bow to it, their control shattered. It was like pulling the plug from a machine they thought could never stop running. Fearlessness activated a law they never accounted for, the law of immunity. That law shields those who refuse to live as hostages to fear. It places a barrier around you that no bribe, no threat, no smear campaign can penetrate. They couldn't understand it. They were used to people folding the second intimidation showed up. They expected you to tremble, to hide, to beg for mercy. But instead your courage exposed how hollow their authority really was. Without fear to feed on, their power starved. It lost its grip. And suddenly, everything they thought was untouchable began to crumble. What they failed to realize is that fear binds the soul tighter than chains, and once those chains break, the soul becomes untouchable. That's why you survived blows that should have crushed you. That's why attacks that destroyed others only strengthened you. You weren't relying on man's protection. You were shielded by a law that responds to courage, and that law made you immune to the very tactics they thought would finish you. Their strategy backfired. By trying to rule with fear, they revealed the one weakness they could never cover, their dependence on it. And by refusing to bow to that fear, you stepped into a realm they could never reach. They could buy loyalty, they could silence voices, they could manipulate laws, but they could not purchase immunity from the collapse that comes when fear loses its grip. That's the law you activated, and it left them powerless against you. Number 13, they forgot that death is the final judge. They built their entire empire around escaping consequences. If a judge stood in the way, they bought him off. If a cop threatened exposure, they silenced him. If the media whispered the truth, they rewrote the story. For years it looked like they were untouchable, but there was one law they could never manipulate, no matter how much power they thought they had: death. Judges retire, cops resign, media loses relevance, but death never clocks out. It waits, it watches, and it never misses its appointment. This was their greatest blind spot. They thought winning in the present meant they had secured their future. But death is the one courtroom where all masks are removed, the bribes, the lies, the intimidation, none of it travels past the grave. They will stand before the final judge, stripped of the very things they trusted in. Titles, influence, wealth. None of it buys immunity in that courtroom. The verdict isn't swayed by charm or persuasion, it's determined by truth alone. What they feared most was this very reality, which is why they drowned themselves in distractions. They kept chasing wealth, power, and recognition because they couldn't face the silence that reminded them of what was waiting. That's why they lived restless, even in luxury. Deep down, they knew that the verdict they had avoided on earth was only temporary. Death doesn't care about earthly power. It equalizes kings and beggars, tyrants and victims. Every soul must testify before the eternal bench, and the record of their deeds speaks louder than any defense they could muster. This is why you didn't need to fight them endlessly. While they scrambled to dodge earthly justice, you understood that mortality itself would finish what man's systems couldn't. Their arrogance blinded them into thinking they had escaped, but in reality they were only stacking evidence against themselves for the final judgment. The truth is simple: they may have bought time, but they cannot buy eternity. Death is unbribable, unbending, and unavoidable. And when that final gavel falls, it won't echo in a courtroom or a newsroom. It will echo in their soul. That was the law they refused to acknowledge, but it's also the one they cannot escape. Number 14, you unlocked the law that needs no audience. They thought control was about visibility. They owned the spotlight, the cameras, the newspapers, and the gossip columns. They believed if they could control what people saw, they controlled reality itself. But the law you tapped into doesn't operate on applause, headlines, or public opinion. It doesn't require validation, acknowledgement, or even witnesses to function. It moves quietly, invisibly, without the need for human recognition. And that's precisely what made it unstoppable. This law doesn't need an audience to verify it. It doesn't care if 1,000 people clap or if nobody notices at all. It executes itself in silence, in ways so subtle that by the time the results appear, the process has already been completed. That's why they could never get ahead of it. They thought as long as they silenced you publicly, they had silenced the outcome. But what they couldn't see was that the law had already started shifting things in the background. And this is why fear gripped them so tightly. They could fight what was visible. They could attack your name in the media, buy off judges in courtrooms, intimidate neighbors, and erase digital traces. But how do you fight something invisible? How do you bribe a law that functions without paperwork? How do you stop a judgment that requires no platform to announce itself? That was their nightmare, realizing that no matter how many eyes they controlled, they couldn't control what was moving behind the scenes. You didn't need the validation of a courtroom audience or a media headline to prove you were right. The law itself became your proof. When their relationships crumbled, when their health declined, when their wealth slipped through their hands despite every calculated move, that was the evidence. And it didn't need to be televised. This law humbles the arrogant because it refuses to play by their rules. It does not pause for applause, it does not wait for witnesses, and it does not require anyone's permission to function. It simply moves, inevitably, irresistibly, with precision. And that's what terrified them the most, realizing too late that the crowd they bought couldn't protect them from the law that never needed an audience in the first place. What they never understood is that true justice doesn't live in the hands of judges, cops, or journalists. It lives in the hands of laws too ancient, too incorruptible, and too precise to be manipulated. They mistook influence for power, but influence only works on men. The laws you unlocked answer to no man, no bribe, no stage. They answer only to truth, balance, and inevitability. Every scheme they set in motion became their own undoing. Every weapon they formed became evidence against them. Every silence they tried to enforce only amplified the verdict already written against them. And here's the reality they couldn't escape. Man's court's close, but higher courts never adjourn. Mortality is unbribable, truth is undefeated, balance is unshakable, and integrity is priceless. They played a short game with money and fear, but you unlocked an eternal law that doesn't expire when the lights go out. So let them buy their headlines, let them silence their tapes, let them rewrite their stories. The joke's on them, because while they fought for control of the stage, you secured control of the script. And the ending has already been written, one they can't edit, erase, or bargain their way out of. That is the final word. Family, if this message hit your spirit the way it was meant to, don't just keep it to yourself. Let's spread it. Go ahead and subscribe to the channel so you never miss these deep revelations. Like this video, drop your thoughts in the comments. I love hearing from you. And don't forget to share it with someone who needs to hear the truth today. Your support keeps this movement alive, and together we're shaking foundations they thought could never be moved. God bless you.